Long before the early Islamic Empire started its massive expansion across the globe, Prophet Muhammad made this really staggering prophecy to his followers. He told them that one day they were going to conquer the ancient mighty land of Egypt. But here's the catch. He gave them a very specific instruction for when that day finally came. He told them to treat the everyday locals with immense kindness. Why? Because they were relatives. But to really grasp the weight of this prophecy, we got to understand the sheer magnitude of what they were trying to conquer. We're not just talking about another piece of territory here. This was the ultimate prize. We're talking about a region with a legacy so staggering it's almost hard to wrap your head around.
So that brings up a pretty pivotal question right off the bat, right? Why Egypt? Well, shortly after the Prophet passed, under the leadership of Umar bin Khattab, the Muslim armies had already pulled off the absolute unthinkable. They had defeated both the formidable Roman and the Persian empires, just massive victories. Yet, instead of pushing deeper into the Roman capital, the newly appointed military commander, Amr bin As, pointed his armies straight towards Egypt. To understand why he made this monumental pivot, we actually have to look at the incredibly dramatic chain of events that put him in charge in the first place.
Okay, so picture this. The Muslim armies are riding this massive, unstoppable wave of victories against the Romans and Persians. But then, absolute disaster strikes. Right as they were securing these new territories, this devastating disease, known as the Plague of Amwas, swept through the region. And this plague, it didn't just slow down their expansion, it tragically wiped out the top Muslim generals. Because of these huge losses, Umar bin Khattab had to step in and appoint new leadership, which is how Amr bin As gets elevated to army chief. Now, when Umar traveled to Syria to assess the situation, actually leaving Ali in charge back in Medina just in case anything happened to him, Amr bin As pitches this bold new plan. March on Egypt, a region whose immense wealth and power had literally been legendary for millennia.
But to truly grasp the allure of Egypt, we need to do a little flashback. Let's travel way, way back, 5,000 years back in time. Back then, the equation for global dominance was actually incredibly simple. Water equals ultimate power. Seriously, think of water back then like oil, or even data today. Whoever controlled the most of it basically controlled the world. And Egypt? Well, Egypt was home to the mighty Nile River. As people flocked from all over the world to settle near this constant life-giving water source, Egypt rapidly transformed into the richest, most powerful region on the entire planet.
So, out of this absolutely thriving population, one man rises above all the rest. King Narmer. He's the guy who officially united the lands of Egypt and established the world's very first major kingdom. And look, we aren't just relying on ancient myths here. The two oldest Egyptian writing tablets ever discovered actually record King Narmer's reign as a historical fact. He essentially laid the foundation for a massive superpower that would rule the world totally unchallenged for the next 1,000 years.
But here's the thing. 1,000 years of absolute, unchallenged supremacy, that does something to a ruler's ego. The pharaohs eventually developed a level of extreme hubris that had literally never been seen before in human history. They decided that just being a king simply wasn't enough anymore. So the pharaohs actually declared themselves to be literal gods. They instituted this whole new state religion where giving absolute obedience to the pharaoh was the one and only way for the common people to achieve paradise. It was, without a doubt, the ultimate system of control to stop any kind of rebellion before it even started.
However, as we know, religious beliefs tend to shift over time, right? And soon enough, a new, honestly bizarre rule for godhood was introduced into Egyptian culture. The concept evolved. Now a pharaoh was no longer just automatically a god forever. No, to maintain their divine status and secure their spot in the afterlife, a pharaoh's physical body had to be preserved perfectly until the end of time. If the body decayed, boom, the godhood was lost. So, how exactly do you ensure your physical body survives until the end of time? Well, you invent a radical new science.
And that's what sparked this intense, high-stakes race for physical preservation. Ancient surgeons started developing this deeply bizarre step-by-step mummification process. Okay, so first, they drained absolutely all the blood from the deceased pharaoh. And yeah, step 2 literally involved taking a hook and pulling the brain out through the nose. I know, pretty gruesome. Third, they removed all the major organs, lungs, liver, kidneys, leaving only the heart safely tucked away in a jar. Fourth, the empty body was soaked in this special saltwater bath for exactly 40 days. And then finally, the whole thing was stuffed with sand to hold its shape, coated in oil and honey, and wrapped super tightly in white strips before being placed in a ridiculously extravagant coffin loaded with food and gold.
But as you can imagine, once this whole process became standard for every passing pharaoh, the competition really started to heat up. It just wasn't enough to have your body mummified anymore. You needed the most magnificent resting place possible to prove your ultimate godhood to everyone. So what started out as just normal buildings and temples covering these mummies rapidly escalated into this fierce architectural arms race. And that, my friends, birthed the era of the pyramids. Every single new pharaoh was constantly trying to build a monument significantly larger than the guy before him.
This absolute obsession finally peaked with Pharaoh Khufu, the mastermind behind the Great Pyramid. This thing was an architectural marvel so incredibly far ahead of its time that it actually held the title of the tallest building in the entire world for an astonishing 3,500 years. Let that sink in, 3.5 millennia. It wasn't until a church in London was constructed centuries and centuries later that Khufu's record was finally broken.
To really put the sheer, mind-boggling scale of the Great Pyramid into a modern perspective, let's compare it to today's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa. Now sure, the Burj Khalifa is taller, but in terms of actual mass, no contest. A single Great Pyramid weighs as much as 12 Burj Khalifas combined. 12! It is so massively huge inside that you could easily park 2,000 large trucks right inside its walls. It's a monument to unfathomable wealth and, honestly, absolute ego.
But, this brings us to a really fascinating turning point. How exactly did an empire that completely dominated the Earth for 3,000 years actually begin its decline? Well, the ultimate irony here is that the very monuments they built to secure their eternal godhood are exactly what triggered their downfall. The pharaohs were just so blinded by their own vanity that they completely missed the fact that the immense, catastrophic cost of building these pyramids was draining all of Egypt's wealth. They were literally triggering a severe economic collapse. It's one of those timeless historical lessons we still see happening with giant corporations and empires today. The very vanity projects meant to cement a legacy are often the exact things that end up bankrupting them.
So just as it seemed like Egypt was about to lose its superpower status forever, this totally unlikely savior appears. A young boy who was famous in historical lore for his striking beauty had actually been sold as a slave in the Egyptian markets and ended up catching the eye of a really powerful minister. This boy grew up to become Prophet Yusuf, or Joseph. Eventually rising all the way up to the rank of prime minister, Yusuf actually partnered with the king to completely overhaul and save the crumbling Egyptian economy. Under his brilliant leadership, the entire empire was stabilized. And because of this, his extended family, the Bani Israel, settled right there in Egypt, eventually becoming its most prominent, prosperous citizens.
As we all know, though, golden ages just don't last forever. Eventually, a massive war broke out. It totally swept away the old ruling family and installed a harsh new pharaoh, kicking off a brand new dynasty. Now, this new ruler immediately cracked down, implementing a super strict system that basically banned outsiders and immigrants from holding any power or influence whatsoever. And it's really interesting. The source material for this explainer actually draws a highly provocative, modern political parallel right here. The author specifically compares this ancient exclusion tactic directly to the immigration restrictions of Donald Trump. Take sides on that, but we definitely want to highlight the source's core argument, which is that leaders throughout history have frequently utilized the exclusion of outsiders as a tool to consolidate their own power.
So, under this intensely oppressive new regime, the Bani Israel had their businesses forcibly shut down and were thrown into brutal slavery. They had to endure this strict, totally devastating enslavement for 400 long years. Just imagine that. But amazingly, throughout these 4 centuries of total darkness, they managed to hold on to one singular shred of hope, a prophecy that said a liberator would eventually rise up from among them and finally break their chains.
Well, it turns out the pharaoh actually caught wind of a very similar prophecy from one of his astrologers, warning him that a boy would be born from the Bani Israel who would completely end his 3,000-year Egyptian empire. Terrified of losing his grip on power, the pharaoh issued this truly horrific decree to kill every single newborn boy of the Bani Israel. But, and honestly, you really can't make this stuff up. In a striking twist of historic irony, the very boy who was destined to dismantle his entire empire, Prophet Musa or Moses, somehow slipped through the cracks. And not only that, he was unwittingly raised by the pharaoh himself, right inside his very own palace.
Fast forward a bit. When Musa grew up and fully accepted his prophetic mission, he went straight up to the pharaoh, who was now Ramses, and confronted him with one simple demand: free the Bani Israel. After a series of absolutely undeniable miracles, like the river famously turning to blood, Ramses finally caved. He granted them permission to leave. And so, in the dead of night, roughly 600,000 people of the Bani Israel began this massive, historic exodus out of Egypt, heading towards Palestine, finally tasting freedom after 400 years.
But of course, Ramses' hubris just got the absolute better of him. He actually broke his promise, mobilized his entire massive army, and aggressively chased down the fleeing Israelites. Right as he was closing in on them, though, divine intervention saved Musa and his people, while Ramses and his entire army were swallowed up and drowned in the sea. Historians broadly agree today that this catastrophic defeat of Ramses, which was driven entirely by his own massive ego, officially marked the permanent end of Egypt's 3,000-year golden era. The spell was finally broken. The whole world suddenly saw the truth. The pharaoh wasn't a god at all. He was just a mortal man.
From that point on, Egypt entered what is commonly known as its Dark Ages. They rapidly lost that superpower title. We see this total cascade of foreign powers just sweeping through the region. Power quickly shifted over to Palestine under Prophet Suleiman. Then Egypt was actually conquered by Alexander the Great, and eventually the whole thing fell right into the hands of another massive, rising superpower.
And that superpower, the great Roman Empire. The Romans swept in, conquered Egypt with absolute full force, and they held onto it tightly for 600 consecutive years. For 6 whole centuries, literally no one could pry Egypt out of Roman hands. The glorious ancient empire of the pharaohs seemed entirely and permanently lost to history.
Which, incredibly, brings us right back full circle to where we started. After 600 years of totally unchecked Roman dominance, the prophecy of Prophet Muhammad was finally ready to be fulfilled. Umar bin Khattab's Muslim armies, led by Amr bin As, now stood right at the very gates of Egypt, gearing up to challenge the Roman grip on this ancient, legendary land.
And they did it. The Muslim army successfully conquered Egypt, shifting that 5,000-year legacy completely out of Roman hands and into a brand new era. But here's the most fascinating part. True to that original instruction from Prophet Muhammad, they didn't arrive as these brutal, oppressive overlords. Unlike the oppressive rulers of the past 5 millennia, they actually arrived with a totally different mandate: to treat the local Egyptians with profound kindness, recognizing them as kin.
It is honestly such a remarkable journey when you step back and look at it. From the incredible water wealth of King Narmer, through the massive god complex of the pyramid builders, to the catastrophic hubris of Ramses, and finally, to the gates opening for a new, kind world order under the early Muslims. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to really ponder. What actually happens when the immense weight of 5,000 years of absolute hubris and power finally collides with a completely new vision for the world? The history of Egypt proves that no matter how high the pyramid or how strong the pharaoh, every single empire eventually faces the tide of change. Look at the power structures in our world today, and seriously ask yourself, who is building pyramids right now, and what tide of change is coming for them? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.